Okay, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. My name is Kernahan Webb. I am a professor in the Law and Business Department at the Business School here at Ryerson University. I'm also appointed to the law faculty, and I am the director of the Ryerson University Institute for the Study of Corporate Social Responsibility. And today we are very fortunate to have as a guest speaker in conversation with me, Dr. Victoria Hurth. More about her in a second, speaking about an exciting new standard that ISO has developed called ISO 37000, Governance of Organizations. So I'm going to go through some opening bits that are relevant here. First is a land acknowledgement, and you can see the land acknowledgement here that we are in the dish with one spoon territory, and we are grateful for the opportunity to work from this particular land territory in cooperation with these First Nations groups. Also, just to note that the university is in the process of renaming itself, so stay tuned in that regard. Next slide, please. For all of the Ryerson CSR Institute sessions, we start from this definition of social responsibility, which comes from the ISO 26000 standard. More about ISO in a second, but briefly in terms of what we are talking about within the CSR Institute deliberations is this definition: the responsibility of an organization for the impacts of its decisions and activities on society and the environment through transparent and ethical behavior, contributing to sustainable development, taking into account expectations of stakeholders in compliance with applicable law and consistent with international norms of behavior, and integrated not only throughout the organization, but also practiced in its relationships to others. And in a lot of ways, one could say that this definition begs the question, and exactly how is it that organizations are going to be able to live up to this social responsibility standard? That's exactly where ISO 37000 comes in. We can move to the next slide, please. We frame, again, at the Ryerson CSR Institute, we frame everything that we do from the premise that in the 21st century, when we're dealing with complex, fast evolving, multi-jurisdictional, environmental, social, and economic challenges, the only way we can effectively address these really challenging issues is by harnessing the unique energies and capabilities of all three, of government, the private sector, and civil society, through a combination of rule instruments, processes, institutions, and actors, sometimes operating collaboratively and sometimes operating in more of a check and balance or rivalrous manner. And again, when we talk about combination of government, private sector, and civil society, that's really ultimately what ISO is all about. And it does it through a rule instrument, and it does it through particular processes, which again, we'll be talking about in some detail in this particular conversation with Dr. Hurth. Just letting you know that there's some very exciting Ryerson CSR Institute sessions coming up in January. If you go to the Ryerson CSR Institute website and click on events, you will see two ones coming up in January that I think you're going to find very interesting. In a lot of ways, they kind of follow down right after what we'll be talking about here, because they're dealing with what happens within companies, within organizations. And just to mention that all of our talks are available and accessible from the Ryerson CSR Institute webpage, and that's how you get to it, just by Googling those two items. We have a very, very good Bachelor of Commerce and MBA program, and there's going to be a certificate course in sustainability and corporate responsibility offered in January, information there. And if you want to receive information concerning upcoming Ryerson CSR Institute talks, just email me. That is my email address there. Next slide, please. So we've done that. We can move on to the next slide. Victoria, we are very, very fortunate to have basically the person at the very top of the pyramid in terms of the development of the ISO 37000 standard. She co-led that process with one other excellent individual, and she also is co-leading new work also in the governance area pertaining to indicators of effective governance and guidance for their use. And she is strongly connected with the University of Cambridge Institute for Sustainability Leadership, where she's a fellow. She works with the University of Cambridge Judge Business School as well. And she describes herself as a pracademic at the intersection of academia and hands-on business. Next slide, please. Throughout this talk, for the first part of it, it will be Victoria and I kind of bouncing the tennis ball from one side of the court to the other. We will attempt to cover off really all of the important points as we see it, but you have the ability to send me an email with any question that you think would also be useful for Dr. Hurth to answer, and I will do my best to fold those questions into my conversation with Dr. Hurth, and then starting after about 60 minutes into a more open-ended one where I'll just be saying, here's a question we got from so-and-so and so-and-so. And just another point, we have got people participating from around the world. Thank you very much for all of you people who are participating at oddball hours of the day and night around the world. I know we've got people from as far away as China and Australia and Latin America and continental Europe, as well as in the Americas. So welcome to you all. We have a cross-section of people. We've got government people, private sector people, civil society organizations, representatives, academics. So we've got a great cross-section. Everybody's eager to learn more about ISO 37000. So I'm going to now take down these slides here and welcome Victoria directly for agreeing to basically walk us through the ISO 37000 standard. But let's start right at the very beginning. Let's talk a little bit about ISO just as an organization, because I'm not sure everybody participating in the Zoom understands what ISO is. So maybe you can just say a few words about that to begin with.
Yeah, sure. And it's great to be here. Thanks for having me, and good to see everybody in the list of participants. Unfortunately, that's probably as far as it's going to go, but I'm on LinkedIn, so please do get in touch and connect with me there. It's a really important place to start, because it doesn't surprise me that in general ISO is not very well understood. And my view is that, especially as we move into the window of time that's fast closing to address a number of the issues we do, I think ISO is going to have to take a more prominent role. We should all therefore understand what it can do and the facility that it represents. So ISO is essentially a governance group, you might say. It's a membership body that's made up of essentially national member bodies, which are national standardization organizations. There are about 164 of them across the world, and essentially they are one step removed from government. And together they form ISO, and they have very particular way of governing the whole system, but it very much is membership led. And that makes it incredibly interesting and powerful. It kind of came out of the Second World War, not specifically Bretton Woods, but around that period. So it had existed in a small form, but there was a sense that actually the world needed this, if the idea being that we increased harmony across the world by smoothing trade and interrelations in general. So ISO really fits within that role. It has therefore very much an organizational perspective, business, but really not beyond that. So nearly all standards are written for all organizations. And what makes it really powerful is the fact that it is one stage removed from government, but that it really is a really properly global network that has structures in place for the standards that are created to be used. They are proposed ultimately by countries, and therefore kind of come in and go back out, although they're always voluntary. ISO standards are always voluntary. So yeah, and the other thing to say about ISO is that it is basically a highly refined consensus building facility, global facility. That's probably the best way of understanding it in relation to what I just said, which means it has over the years refined how to best arrive at expressing the global consensus, how to make sure that new standards don't duplicate old ones or create confusion. Now it's not perfect at it, but it's as good as we're going to get. And if it isn't good, we need to make ISO better at it. And I think that's really, I suppose, the key message here, that ISO is the way in which we can come together in a truly multi-stakeholder way and decide what we think about a topic in a way that it is then likely to have a lot of influence at the national level.
Thanks, Victoria. I mean, I think the thing about ISO is that it's actually not an intergovernmental body. It's not part of the UN, for example. However, attracts UN entities to participate in the development of it, and other intergovernmental bodies like the OECD and that sort of thing, as well as governments, as well as private sector organizations, as well as civil society organizations from both developed and developing countries. And ISO has developed more than 20,000 standards at this point that cover off everything from screw sizes and film development categories through to management system standards. And in the management system standards category, there are well over 2 million organizations around the world that have been basically audited as in compliance with these non-governmental standards on a wide variety of different topics. So essentially, when we get to the ISO 37000 standard, it's building on this existing momentum and legitimacy that ISO has in the world as a kind of a leading entity for developing standards that help organizations operate across jurisdictions.
Yeah, absolutely. It might be worth me, I don't know if that's okay there, Kernahan, to just add a couple of extra little points for context. Is that it started really out at ISO as a sort of let's standardize widget X, it's going to make life easier. And of course, in the context of sustainability, that's also increasingly important, and it's taken us too long to get there. But then moved up to management system standards. And then, of course, with ISO 37000 is the first time really, although we did have something on the governance of IT, but it's the first time that there's been a foundational stance on beyond management systems, that sort of governance aspect. And I think that's really important to note because, as ISO moves into those more strategic, issues, I think their role becomes different ultimately, and I think that's starting to be reflected, and also to say that they're very specific. There's specific rules around open engagement, but you have to fulfill certain criteria to become a liaison. There are companies that routinely send lots of people to meetings, but they are only allowed really as observers. They obviously go there because they think they might have more influence than that, but ultimately the process is very well structured. And when it comes to voting, it's very much done via the national member bodies. So like I say, yeah, really a highly refined process for us to work with.
Yeah. And if you think of how we all on New Year's Day have our New Year's resolutions, and sadly, most of us fall by the wayside at some point during the year, but that's because those just represent our wishes. Whereas governance is all about how do you ensure that your wishes are actually fulfilled. So You've got ESG, environmental, social, and governance. We're focusing here with ISO 37000 on the governance side, which is the part that's all about ensuring that whatever it is you want to do, you actually are, in fact, able to deliver on that. So it's a super important kind of piece of the puzzle, building on all of the other ISO standards that are out there. And of course, a huge range of laws and other things that are out there that go beyond the remit of ISO. But ISO represents a kind of a common framework and a common language that works across all, which of course is so important in this area where we have a wide range of laws in place pertaining to a wide range of different organizations. Can you just say a little bit about how it is you yourself got involved in ISO? Because I'm anticipating that probably when you were a child, you did not say to your mom and dad, when I grow up, I want to be a co-convener of ISO 37000.
No, but as a very young teenager, I was focused on understanding organizations and business and understanding their influence in the world and how I could make that influence more positive. So there is a direct link actually there, but you're right. And in fact, I remember saying to myself, it is a sign of my maturity that I now understand the role of standards and that I'm willing to commit time to doing it. So I do think it is one of those times that you kind of think, oh, I must be a grown-up. I understand the role of standards, because they are often seen as, like you say, boring and, you know, what's the point? And they take so long and it's so bureaucratic. But actually, in terms of global bureaucratic processes, ISO probably has more bang for its buck than many other things that you could be involved with. So, which I'm sure we'll get onto. So I first started because my bringing the role of business and understanding sustainability started for me in 2002, and it wasn't long after that I was part of a presentation by David Jackman, who had been involved working for the FSB, I think it was, in the UK, bringing in ethics. And had been working in set up something called the Ethics Mart, started to work beyond tick boxing within organizations, and he was trying to get a British standard in sustainable communities going. So I helped him to do that and was involved in that process. That then became and was sort of became part of what was then work within TC 268 around sustainable communities in general. And I became the lead expert for the standard, the ISO 37120 on sustainable city indicators.
Okay.
So this was a list of standardized indicators for cities to be able to go beyond. So there's a theme here, to go to, especially to the work that's happening now, but to be able to go beyond just reporting what various rankings were telling them they had to report, you know, just randomly, to say, well, actually, you know, what are these standardized indicators so that we can unite the energy? And that's when I, you know, really got into the ISO world. And then I realized that whilst that was very important, my contribution, my strategic contribution to the issue of sustainability was really in organizations and helping organizations as a whole. And at the time, I basically asked my contact at BSI, I said, look, the work, we're about to publish the standard on sustainable cities. It's going to move into smart cities and this, and that's all well and good. But I don't think, you know, because constantly my question is, what does the world need of me? What I can uniquely bring. If someone else can do it, I need to be off trying to find something that doesn't have someone like me to be able to do. So I said, what's going on at the moment? And there were two standards that had just been talked about. One in social value, British standard, and ISO standard, new technical committee and governance of organizations, and then the flagship standard to be developed. So I got involved in both of those, and both of those have come to fruition. So the 8950 in social value has happened, and Jeremy, who led that, is now leading our work on indicators, and obviously 37,000. But really, just to briefly answer, the real reason that I got involved in 37,000 is because I had realized that So I started my journey looking at the role of marketing, because I realized that companies were altering society and identities in a way that was to maximize their profits and not in a way that was actually contributing to society's well-being. I didn't understand how they were doing it, why they were doing it. So I went on a journey from a teenager, studied management, et cetera, et cetera. That led me to focusing in on the role that marketing plays, especially in a postmodern world, as one of the key ways, because it's the value generation heart of an organization. So if your marketing is basically for profit maximization, then it's kind of obvious what the kind of consequences might be. And those were ones that we were seeing all around us. I then realized that in order to, so I did a lot of work on the kind of marketing we needed. And I realized I had to take people through a journey of understanding the economic paradigm of which marketing is attached to, and that we need to, and that even the idea of marketing has been subverted by the system, et cetera, et cetera. And that if we were going to be able to address marketing, we needed to address the nature of the organization in which marketing sits, or we were never going to be able to produce positive outcomes for society. And so purpose for the last 5-6 years, purpose-driven organizations, defining it, has been absolutely core to my work. And then I realized about, again, 6 years ago, that we were not going to bring about purpose-driven organizations without the right kind of governance. So that really was why I got involved in 37,000, because it was something very practical, although like I say, it might not seem practical unless you have crossed that maturity threshold where standards seem practical. But yeah.
Well, that's excellent, and certainly that that purpose heart of this standard really beats loudly and clearly in the standard. We'll talk more about that in a second. Just again, for the benefit of those who are not kind of in the tent already in terms of ISO language, all of the work of ISO is divided into technical committees. So you will see us referring from time to time to TC this and TC that. That's a technical committee. So it's just a grouping of experts and a particular subject matter that they're addressing. And Technical Committee 309 is the committee that is specifically charged with the responsibility of developing governance-oriented standards. And they have several already, in addition to ISO 37000, there's one on anti-bribery and corruption, there's another on compliance, one on whistleblowing, and more are coming. And we'll talk about the more that are coming. But, and another point, people ask, what is with the numbers? 37,000, 14,001, 9,001, and all of that. This is just a way that ISO developed, very bureaucratic, where they can essentially allocate, for example, an entire series, say 9,000, and say, we don't know how many standards ultimately will be developed in that area. So we'll give this entire 9,000, grouping to current and upcoming standards. So you see 9004, 9005, 9006, 9007, and the same is possible now with respect to 37,000. So that's just a little background information here. So let's now talk about the 37,000 standard itself and the process of development. It sounds like it essentially started from the UK standards organization that is part of ISO, which is called BSI, which is the British Standards Institute. That was kind of the key inspirational spot, and the ladder that Victoria climbed into ISO. I climbed in through Canadian standards bodies myself, but we all ended up here. So Victoria, can you just talk a little bit about that process of development, who is involved, and the various stages, consensus, and all that sort of thing?
Yeah, sure. So yeah, essentially what happens, it's part of this membership body structure, is that any member body can nominate a topic of work. So they can create a proposal, a new item proposal, to say, look, this is work that we think needs to be created. And often that happens if they've developed a national standard that they think actually would be a topic that is needed internationally. And in this case, British Standard Institute had developed the only national standard coming out of a national standards body on governance. And there was some kind of technical specification also coming from Germany, but a full standard in the UK. And so that was used as the basis to put forward also the idea to create the technical committee. So the UK is sort of secretariat at the technical committee level, which means it sort of administers it, and the chair is from the UK. And at the same time, there was a co-chair. So there's a lot of twinning that goes on to try to make sure that it's not sort of all, especially not all too Western, but not also too one type of group of organizations. So China was co-chair for quite a number of years, and that's now twinning. That twinning has now happened with Trinidad and Tobago, and that twinning with Trinidad and Tobago had happened at, of course, the working group level, which is the level that I sit at, the governance as a governing group, the working group level, and Axel, who you referred to, was sitting there. So it got proposed, everyone had to vote on it. And what happened at the very first meeting of the technical committee was, because it was such a big standard, and it is, just to give you, the people who are on the call here, a sense of the fact that this is new ground. Governance is such a big topic. It's actually, although it goes back thousands of years, of course, actually in terms of governance of organizations, it's really quite young. We're talking sort of 1900, mid 1900s. I mean, even really Bob Garrett, being cited as the first person to talk about the practice of governance in that way, Cadbury definition, we're talking decades old in terms of that. And so what we had was sort of still probably in that fragmentation phase, and governance really being talked about in terms of the economic paradigm in which it grew up, which was very much, that sort of business is there to make money. And that then spread out to a sense of that, how organizations very much financialization of life in general. So that was the context. So for ISO to say, actually, we think that the world is ready now to have a voice to say what we really think the governance is. I mean, even definitionally, most governance codes just have like a page of description of governance, was actually quite a big deal. So in that first technical committee meeting, there was pushback from people who either didn't think that it should be developed, or perhaps didn't think that the UK should be leading it. I don't know, but it was a highly politicized environment at that moment. And so there was a decision that a year preparatory work should be done. So an ad hoc group was set up, and I co-led that ad hoc group in order to explore whether a standard in governance should be made, and whether ISO had a role to play in that. So that was an intense, that really, and it was hard because ad hoc groups shouldn't be doing the work of a working group, but actually it was hard not to. So really the standard was developed, you might say, over sort of that full 5-year process rather than the 4. So it was a year's ad hoc group. And then went to those 4 years. And there's a very defined process. There's a maximum period. Goodness, they've shortened that by a year. And we, in the governance, in working group 1 for this standard, took the absolute maximum. We were right on the deadline, as you can imagine, because of the nature of what we were doing here. And of course, as we were changing it, in the last 5 years, the whole context of business and organizations in general, because this is a standard for all organizations in all countries in all sectors, was changing so fast. So it took that full period. So the way, if you kind of have some of the detail of the process and how it works, actually how it used to work pre-COVID was that we would have 2 face-to-face meetings a year. Now, some groups would have more than that, and they would have the odd online meeting. Now, we were very keen, Axel and I, to make sure that this was as inclusive as possible. So from the very beginning, we really encouraged people to dial in virtually, also to reduce the, the physical impact of the events, and to increase inclusivity, because there are lots of negatives when you're building ISOs to being reliant on face-to-face, including the contribution of developing countries. So we always had that. And then, of course, when COVID hit, it went all fully online. But even before that, to be honest, 2 meetings a year, we were having, we've had over 100 meetings, of probably on average about 3 hours each. So these are a lot, and these are not just like talk shops, these are workshops. So we have the standard online. We are looking through every single detail of text. So different groups work themselves out in different ways. We very much took the time at the beginning to build the group, to help understand the stakeholders, to help ourselves put ourselves in stakeholder shoes or understand where that was missing, to build that sort of team operation so that we could operate as a team even when we were virtual. And that's, I think, really helped, because even now we've got such a strong team and such a wonderful group of experts. We then also split off into groups. And there were very fine tuning going on every meeting to make sure, is this the right way of organizing the group at this moment in time? And what would happen was a group might go away with tasked with something that the working group as a whole would say, yeah, look, we need something on this, or we need this investigated. For example, what are the existing codes out there? What are the key, we had to distill the principles to begin with, for example. So groups would go away and then they would come back and they'd make a suggestion, and we'd have a debate, and we'd try to bring all the voices in the room, and then we'd try to hold what we think is the consensus, either merging or actual, and then we would continue. And you can imagine, because we might then, in the next meeting, half the people weren't there who were in the meeting before, and then there were a whole load of new people who would be asking the fundamental questions, So that was quite tough. And also what was tough, there was a real tension at the beginning from people that thought, genuinely, we cannot move forward unless we have a definition of governance. Now, I'm an academic, so I'm all for putting definitions first. They're absolutely critical. However, there's a difference between exposing your fundamental concepts and what you think to be true roughly, versus saying we have to have a fully defined definition before we can do anything. Now, when you're talking about something like governance, in a way, that's the answer. That's what happens when you've done everything and you've written the standard. Now we know what governance is, because look, it's this. So we really had to kind of build enough faith in us as conveners so that we could say, look, we understand how you're feeling. Let's get down the key components, but then let's put this as a working draft and to definition and put it on the side, and let's start the work. Because otherwise we'll never go anywhere if we wait till we've got the definition. And in the end, that worked, and we did get a definition, and it was all fine. But I'm shortcutting a lot of pain when describing that. But there were some very crunchy. Generally, I would say, as long as people get a chance to expose their views, listen to each other, and as conveners, we can decode what people are really saying, because often people are saying the same thing in a slightly different way. That's normally what's happening. So if you can get underneath that, and that's the thing, that's the reason I decided to do this job, because it's something that I think is sort of one of those things I enjoy doing. And I feel like I have a natural tuned in for, is what are people really saying here? And then by doing that, we can move forward, because we've created a common ground. Then we say, well, what do we call it, right? And then you have to say, well, does it work in Latin America? Does it work, is this translatable as a concept? If not, let's choose a different word. What can we use? So I think creating that spirit where people are not too hung up on words. And if you've got that spirit in the group, then you can usually get through most issues. And one of the biggest issues, for example, we had was, do we use the word oversight or control? So control being a really important word within the existing governance sphere. It was the original Cadbury's definition. It's been perpetuated across all the governance codes. And so it's direction and control. And then you have, of course, this emerging idea, and there's a very strong representation from Canada, of course, as well, in that there are different types of organizations. The word control can be very loaded. It feels very domineering. And actually, what about networked organizations? organizations. And so in the end, we managed to persuade, and there really was sort of two sides of this camp, to say, well, we'll use oversight, but we will use the word controls with an S, controls, within the organization, because that is a technical term that is correct. So we managed to move forward. But, you know, that's just an example, Ken.
Victoria, that's great. Over here in Canada and United States, we talk about inside baseball. You've given us a little bit of inside baseball as to the sorts of tug of wars that go on. And believe me, I know what you're talking about. Although you needed the full 5 years from the ad hoc group through to completion of the standard, and it's really an amazing achievement that you did that. I was involved in the development of ISO 26000, the social responsibility standard. That had a 10-year, and I was there from day one as the person who suggested it originally through to the bitter end. So there was 2 sets of ad hoc groups before it even was created as a, and on and on. But I won't go down that rabbit hole now. Other than
congratulations.
To say, yeah. Other than to say, though, that for the benefit of everybody here on the Zoom, the ISO has a structured process which starts off with a working draft, which is hammered out directly by the working group members from around the world. And then it goes through a committee draft, and then it goes through a draft international standard, and then it goes into a final draft international standard, and then it's published. So at each stage, there's opportunities for consultations, input, and so on. And essentially for this consensus building to take place. And that's a unique thing about ISO standards, is that they're all developed through consensus. So this basically means you as a convener, one as a convener, has to find a way of bringing people together who are currently not together. So your point about the let's call it the tug of war over oversight versus control, and the ultimate compromise that was reached, is a great example of how consensus is reached. But really, more importantly, underlying that is people from around the world with different languages, cultures, laws, organizations that they have in mind when they're talking about this, all coming together to have a common idea as to how it is a organization can be properly governed. So it's really a remarkable achievement. The ISO 37000 standard is, and so is ISO, in terms of the structure that it has created and the process that it has created that led to it. But that all have been said. Now let's talk about ISO 37000. Can you just walk us through, first of all, just walk us through its approach, key features, and so on?
Yeah, okay, yeah, sure. So it has, I wonder if maybe before I do that, I just briefly show on screen a map from the representation, just building on that point that you just had there, Kanahan, because if I show you this screen, you can see this is the technical committee and governance, and that really represents who is involved in building ISO 37000. Now, participating members can vote, and observing members can't vote on, as Kanahan said, the different stages of the draft. But they can comment and they can be involved in the process in every other way. So you can see there just the expanse of the representation. And if we take governance as an example, the OECD is probably the next most representative organization to have produced a standard or a code guidance in governance. And that doesn't have the level of representation of ISO. I think it's about 2/3 of the size. And of course, it doesn't have the process, the multi-stakeholder process to get involved in developing it. So just gives you a bit of a sense there.
Yeah,
so
well, just to mention though, the OECD also fantastic intergovernmental organization. It really only has governments as direct participants. Everybody else is not a direct participant. And also it is essentially if I could say it kind of bluntly, it's kind of a wealthy country organization, whereas ISO is very much has more member countries from developing countries than developed countries, and makes a real effort to ensure that the developing country voice is fully represented. So I think that is a real key distinguishing feature between OECD and ISO.
Yeah, very, very good points. And in the context of all standards and governance, particularly, and all of the standards being produced within the Technical Committee 309, is that, you know, if you are a country that doesn't have the institutional capacity in order to, you know, create and develop its legislation in quite the same way, then ISO is really a gift, because you have something to lean on that has been developed, that you have some confidence in saying that this is going to be understood by the world, accepted by the world. And if you work to that and build your legislation around that, then you're putting yourself in a good position. And I think in the context of 37,000, I mean, that, but all standards really, but especially these governance ones, because whilst all ISOs are voluntary, ultimately they have, because of their government aligned network, have the potential to be brought into law and leaned on for law. So yeah, it's a really good point, especially in relation to countries with less institutional capacity, right?
Just to mention, just hold on just for a second, you've mentioned the Cadbury report. So just to be clear, Cadbury is a UK report that looked into it, and commission and so on, that looked into governance in the UK, and inspirational in terms of sort of key concepts moving forward. And of course, there's the King Commission from South Africa that also did some really important, I think, kind of foundational work in this area. But just to mention that, because you did mention Cadbury, and for a lot of people, what immediately comes to mind is chocolate and you know, Quakers and so on, which, you know, is relevant, but perhaps not so directly.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And yes, like you say, I mean, more recently, King Commission, and, you know, has done huge amounts. It's just that was the first time, I think, that there was, and it just shows you how new it is, that there was a formalized, which is why it's been leaned on across the world, because it was that kind of commission around governance. But again, is just symptomatic of the fact that the governance has been in context to investors protecting their assets. So that has been the sort of zeitgeist in which governance has grown up. So but the realization that in reality governance is much more than that, and that we need it to be way much more than that, is something that has been developing in parallel, and which 37,000 is really the kind of the culmination of all of those sentiments into a very practical, clear, definitive sort of way of expressing that. Now, it's the first word, global word in good governance of organizations. It's not by any way or means the last. And that's the whole point. You take a blank sheet of paper, you try and build this kind of, what is the global consensus? You know, it is remarkable for its integrity in terms of its internal consistency, in terms of its specificity, etc., and completeness. But, you know, now it's in use, and we now want to understand how it can be made even better. And it's not really until you have the first one out there that stakeholders that might just be looking and from the distance to see, oh, you know, what might be produced, can kind of really pile in their efforts to improve going forward. So one other feature of ISOs is that they are always reviewed on a rolling basis. So every 5 years maximum, but it can be sooner, and for some types of standards sooner than that. So yeah, would you like me now to just dive into 37,000?
Please do.
Okay, so what we have is a standard that is, well, the first thing I'd like to show you is this screen to give it in context. So you can see here, this is 37,000, where it sits within, we talked about the Technical Committee 309. So you can see 37,000 there sitting at the in the sphere of governance. And then, of course, we have the, and Kernahan mentioned some of these management system standards within TC 309, you know, that sit within this technical committee, like anti-bribery, whistleblowing, and compliance management. And then we have standards that are not within the technical committee, but which are related. So, and you know, for example, let's just take risk. a lot of great care to make sure that there was consistency across that, but also in terms of the governance of IT. So this, I mentioned that there had been a governance standard, and I think there was also one on HR. So this is the example of non-TC 309 standards that deal with governance in some way, and here are those that are sitting outside. So so probably the best way of describing the fundamentals of the standard is this diagram. Now, before I just dive into that, to say that that at the beginning of the standard, there are always definitions at the beginning of the standard, and those can take the longest time to actually agree. But usually you would take standards that already exist and modify them if needs be. But in this standard, there are some very significant, important definitions that help clarify aspects that had been blurred before. So you'll have them up top, but also at the top, that kind of context of governance is really important in this standard, as is what we call clause 4, which talks about, governance, the context of governance, what we mean by governance, governance and stakeholders, governance and management, so really defining those core concepts, including governance at the competence, governing body competence. So whereas what you often get in some of the codes is more of a deep dive into governing body competence, actually that sits up in clause 4. And what we have in the main body of the standard in terms of the principles and behaviours is actually those principles and behaviours of the governing body and the governing system doing the governance. But obviously the ability, for that to happen, the governing body has to be competent and has to make sure that it renews itself and renews its understanding and knowledge. So we made a point of making that clear up top. So what we have here then is the main sort of body of the principles and behaviours, and that's how most standards are set out. We did start from a time where it was basically at the sort of behavioural level, so standards became a bit of a tick box exercise, and then in recent years moving very much to principle-based standards, which give you a sort of rule of thumb of how to approach situations, or sort of like broad things you need to think about, of which behaviours sit underneath. And actually, I was saying to Kernahan, I'm technical author for what will be the world's first national standard in purpose-driven organizations. And that actually starts with worldviews, because ultimately worldviews underpin principles. And if we really want to get to the heart of the matter, that's where I think most standards should start. Anyway, not necessarily the easiest thing to do though. So here we have, you can see the primary principle, and this is the principle on which all other aspects need to be understood, is the purpose principle. So I agree with you, Kernahan, in terms of what you said about governance being about fulfilling the wishes, but obviously, of course, governance is also about defining the wish, clarifying that wish, and making sure that that direction is really clear. So that sort of what is the wish starts fundamentally with purpose, and also includes value generation, and then those are the two sort of like, what are we trying to do in the world? What value are we trying to create for whom? Then you have strategy. So we've moved here, by the way, from primary governance principle, you see, to the foundational ones. So, so whereas purpose is why do we exist and what fundamentally are we here in terms of value to produce? Value generation then says, okay, so let's get into a bit more detail now. What value do we want to create, define, make sure comes about, make sure that what value do we want to make sure isn't destroyed, and how can we express that as a value generation model to guide the organization and guide the business model, essentially. And then having that clear direction about what the organization is there to do. Strategy is the bit that when you start to have this real overlap traditionally, because of course the governing body literally is ultimately accountable for everything in the organization, and every organization has a governing body, and that and even if it's just one person organization and a governing body of one, and that governing body in theory can decide where it could do everything in the organization if it wanted to. It's all about delegation. So what is expressed here is the sort of the norm in terms of what tends to happen. And so what tends to happen is that strategy is the place that the management will then execute the direction given by the governing body. And so strategy is that principle that really sort of sets out those sort of boundaries, saying that the governing body needs to set the strategic outcomes. So be really clear about what are the outcomes that the strategy itself should be delivering, because strategy is a way to achieve something. So strategic objectives are what are the thing, and those need to be clearly and logically delivering the value intended in order to achieve the purpose. But governing body shouldn't just then like let the executive get on with delivering the strategy. They need to be engaged, because ultimately the governing body has governance levers in its hands. And if it is not sufficiently aware and with the organization in terms of really understanding the dynamic context in which it operates and challenges that are being faced, then the governing body could be working against the organization achieving what it wants it to achieve in the first place. So that engagement part is really important. And then you have the two areas that you're probably really familiar with of oversight and accountability. Now in that, and I again mentioned that Cadbury definition because that's the one that's been perpetuated across the globe, is that that governance of organization is about direction and control, i.e. the direction as we set out there, and then the oversight. But accountability was always really core. And in this standard, we've really just pulled that out. So, so oversight really clarifies the sort of system of internal controls, you know, financial management control, the internal auditing. So what is the framework of system of controls that the governing body needs to have in order to make sure that what it wanted to be achieved and the way in which it wanted it to be achieved should be achieved? Just looping back slightly, purpose also includes defining the values. So it's purpose and values, and you can't really understand your purpose unless you understand your values. So those, and that also then guides how you deliver and the parameters in which you set for the organization to work with. And then Victoria, accountability.
This is great here. I'm just going to interject. Here is the definition ultimately of governance from the standard, which I think brings together what you've been saying in a kind of a exploded way. Governance of organizations is defined in ISO 37000 as human-based system by which an organization is directed, overseen, and held accountable for achieving its defined purpose. Mm-hmm. So I think you've touched on each one mm-hmm. of those in your discussion so far. But can you talk a little bit more about just the purpose aspect? I'm looking, for example, here's the purpose of BMO, very big bank operating around the world, Bank of Montreal. And they describe their purpose as to boldly grow the good in business and life. And I get that, and I know you're from you had your origins in the marketing side of things, but how far does that really take us? Can you help out in that regard? It seems very small.
Okay, so yes, and well, so this is where I have different hats that I'm wearing, of course. So in terms of what I feel purpose is and ought to be and how a purpose should be defined, I would have gone further than is specified within 37,000. But what we have in 37,000 is what holds the consensus enough and sets the frame for being able to do purpose well. So you can see it here on the screen. What it does, which is important, is to say that it needs to be anchored in stakeholder understanding, and it needs to be meaningful and relevant. So I would say there is a difference, to answer your question directly with my personal opinion, there is a difference between a purpose statement, which is supposed to be a sort of launch pad for someone understanding why that organization exists, that gives a first high level scoping. Oh, well, it's definitely not this then, it's definitely potentially that. But really, a purpose needs to be a North Star that can guide daily decision making throughout an organization. And therefore, that level of abstraction won't work as that, but it will work as that if leadership, starting with the governing body, are doing enough to elaborate and be clear as what that means in terms of that organization's unique contribution to the world. And I would argue, really, if for a purpose to be valid and meaningful in today's world, it has to be a strategic contribution to long-term well-being for all, which is the definition of sustainability and which is the ultimate end of the economy. And if you can logically show that it is the optimal contribution that your organization can make, given all of your capacities and all of the traditional audit stuff, then you're in good ground. Now, you might then summarize it in that kind of a sentence, and certainly that tells me that it has the potential to have had, that possibly it has a very meaningful, purpose-driven purpose, which to me, we should reserve the word for that. However, without that kind of elaboration, it's very difficult to understand what that might mean. But I'm sure there's elaboration. So it's bringing meaning to it, which is really critical. And that's part of the governing body's role.
I think that's a great point, that you can have a single statement, but you have the elaboration below that single statement, and it certainly requires the reinforcement of the statement and the elaboration underlying it in order for it to effectively be driven throughout the organization in all of its decision making and action. A little bit about values as well, though. I'm just thinking that, do you think that a lot of organizations really have a clearer articulation of their purpose and values, or do they kind of find that out along the way after COVID happens, or after climate change happens, or after whatever? It's at that point that they actually start to articulate exactly what their purpose and values are, as opposed to knowing what they are out of the gate.
Well, it depends what we mean as out of the gate. I mean, the reality is that an organization is made up of individuals, and the organization's values is therefore an expression of what's within the organization as a whole. It's so ultimately you can express what are our organizations, let's say worldviews, because worldviews are essentially where it all starts, because they are, what do you think is valuable to create or destroy? How do you think that the world works? And therefore, what do you think fundamentally needs to be done in order to preserve the value that you think is most important? So this is why purpose and values come out of those worldviews. So those worldviews will exist. They might be disparate. You might have a very, very fragmented culture. They might be really consistent, a very consistent culture. But nonetheless, they will exist. So when you're talking about values there, they will exist. The question is, are they desirable? Are they what you would like them to be? Now, that is a reflexive question that ISO 37000 and others guidance will say you need to not just leave that by chance. You need to understand what your worldviews are. And if you're a governing body, you need to start with what are the worldviews of those in the governing body. Then you can clearly understand what your values are before you otherwise start saying, oh, we need a list of values or we need a purpose. Because if you don't understand the worldviews of you or the people in your organization, it will always be incomplete or false or fake, which is why the process of arriving at your purpose, including expressing your values, is a quite deep soul-searching process. So you have to, including getting stakeholders to hold a mirror up to tell you who you are, which might not be what you want to hear or what you think that you are. So really it's a process, I would say, but I don't think you could say that you're a purpose-driven organization until you're really clear that A, what your worldviews and values, therefore purpose and values are, and that they are purposeful, that they are aligned with something meaningful. And really ISO 37000 starts the first kind of gives you that basic structure for a governing body and for a governance system to start by asking that question. So why do we exist? How does this address problems that people are actually facing? Who are the people that we're primarily delivering for? Who are those that need to support us in delivering that? Those fundamental questions are all prompted in 37000 very strongly.
That's excellent. I'm really going to emphasize your point about process here, and evolving process, because it strikes me that what you think is your worldview and what you think is your purpose and what you think are your values at any particular point is really going to be sparked by what you actually end up dealing with on a day-to-day basis. And we think, a really good example of this is people, once they have children, then they say, now I have a purpose. Now I know my purpose is to get this child, through to adulthood and to productivity and so on. But before I had this child, I existed for X number of years before now. I really didn't know my purpose. So they might have had a worldview before then. They might have had values before that. But having the child then compelled them to essentially realize, these are my values. This is really important. This is not so important, and so on. So I'm just kind of emphasizing that the question of purpose and the question of values is something that, even through a deep stakeholder engagement process, is going to be something that you're going to have to revisit very regularly, because it's only when rubbing up against actual experiences that you really do know what your worldview is, as opposed to just an espoused set of words as to what it is and an espoused set of values. But so I think that is reflected in this standard, in the sense that this standard is all about the process, the ongoing process of understanding what your worldview is, what your purpose is, what your values are, and those will change. They are likely to change over time as you deal with new issues that make this or that issue, value, etc., clear to you.
Yes, I would agree with that. And at the same time, I would say that because purpose sits at the very, and values for an individual, same as for an organization, pretty much everything you can mirror to organizations. I say that, to my students all the time. You wonder how you deal with it. Well, what does it look like for you? And you made that analogy there as well. It's at the deepest level of an identity. And whilst identities mold and are shaped all the time, they also have features that are very enduring. So really what you want is for your purpose to be, and your values to be, things that you also work towards. So it's fine to say, these are our values, but we're not there yet. We're not living it. This is our purpose, but we don't quite yet understand it. But we do understand it's something around this. And that's why there are also really important choices to be made about how specific you are. And if you want to understand if an organization is truly purpose-driven, the level of specificity that they can encode at that highest level is probably a really good indication of it. But it's also a strategic choice, because once you've encoded your purpose and your values, you're then into delivering it. Now, therefore, everything else is strategy. Now, that strategy can also endure for a longer period of time, or it can be very, very fast moving. And you want strategy really to be incredibly agile and fast moving, but you don't really want your core identity to be changing all the time, because otherwise you can't build meaningful relationships, because people don't really know who you are, because you don't really know who you are. But that doesn't mean that you have to pretend you have the answers. And if you don't understand, just like children don't understand, that's okay. But don't pretend that you do have a purpose and values if you're not really sure what those are at all. So it's something about maturity in there as well, for sure.
Which, of course, is another standard. I should be upfront here that I'm involved in the TC 309 myself, and I'm involved in the development of a governance maturity standard that's currently being developed along with the indicators work. So, but that's just an aside. Back to you, Victoria.
Yeah. So and also just to say that this standard, and you mentioned before King 4, and I think or King Commission, it's a really important thing to say, is that actually I think we probably only had one real code out there that was about governance in context of the new reality in which we're living, and very explicitly in the context of sustainable development. So this again also expresses that when that was written was an anomaly, and then across the last 5 to 10 years has become much more understood as the sort of the global norm. So really I'd say it sort of extends, adapts and reflects very much King 4. So you have in here, so what makes therefore 37,000 really great and unique is that it is really robust in that it has very strong roots in what people understand to be governance, but it's not held back by the old view of what we think value generation is. And that this is not also just for, you know, an alternative view of organizations. This is the norm, the emerging norm of the organizations that we need, and therefore the very minimum of how they need to be governed. So having these 11 principles side by side, looking and reading the standard, is quite a big thing, really, because you're like, wow, is that really, we really need governing bodies to do all of that? And the consensus that this is saying is, yes, we do. Now, if that means that your governing bodies need much more training, you need to give them much more time, and you maybe need to pay them much more, then yes, then that's what we need to do. But nothing in here is a sort of negotiable, sort of nice to have, oh, well, if you've got time. And it should be applicable down to an individual of one, even if you might need to interpret the text in a slightly different way, although we've tried to make it as generic as possible. So you can see on the outside, for example, even these enabling principles, which cover some really core areas. So you've got risk governance there, you've got data and decision making. So how does the organization make good decisions? You've got leadership, focusing very much on the sort of ethical and effective leadership, stakeholder engagement and the governance of stakeholder engagement. And then you have viability and performance over time, which is really a lot of that sort of know your system, know your dependencies. It's very much an enlightened self-value principle that brings in all of, like, you know, half of what we understand when we understand sustainability. In other words, well, you know, we're not going to be around for very long if we don't get to grips with this. So really, ultimately, much of what we talk about when we talk about sustainable development is really, how do we just make sure that we're not doing really stupid things, which clearly we have been doing for a very long time. And that requires systems thinking, it requires understanding your dependencies and all of the value that you need to create, and being clear about how you are creating or not creating or destroying it. And then social responsibility. So the need for an organization to make decisions that are aligned with society's expectations, essentially. So all of that sits within there, and while some are enabling and purpose is primary, they all work together, and all of them are needed. And that's really the key message. We need all of these things. Yeah.
And I honestly, that ability to bring this all together into a coherent whole, and then the subdivisions within it, I think is the ultimate accomplishment that this standard has achieved. We've got a number of questions from around the world, and I thank everybody for providing them. I'll just read them all out, and that way you can kind of sift through and answer them in whatever is the sort of the hierarchy that you want to. One was a question specifically on ISO 26000, and what's the connection between ISO 26000 and ISO 37000, ISO 26000 being the social responsibility standard of ISO. So that was one question. Another was with respect to small and medium-sized organizations, and particularly those that are not for profit. How well does this work when dealing with that much smaller and non-profit type of organization? Another was the ethics is mentioned here, ethical behavior, but can you speak on exactly what is meant and how does ethics fit into this? Another question was on, this is a guidance standard, which means that organizations cannot be certified to it. So is there anything in the future planned for that? And let me just see if there was, well, another one was just on, are there mirror committees created around the world which allow local stakeholders to kind of feed into this work? And I'll just answer that one. Yes, there are. You can be involved in these. So we'll get that one out of the way here. But over to you then. If you need me to kind of jolt your memory on any of them, let me know. But take them in whatever order you want.
Thank you. Yeah, I have made a note of them. So interestingly, I wrote off my own back, because I thought it was necessary, about 10 years ago. I wrote connecting a document that connected ISO 26000 and integrated reporting, actually. You might not know that. Didn't have my name on it because it was just produced as an ISO document, but it was a sort of a linking document. Because I wasn't involved in the development of 26000, I know it was a massive, massive undertaking and a real feat to get that out. So, and congratulations to everyone who managed to do that, because if nothing else, and we can discuss, the technicalities of it, but if nothing else, it really said, this matters, and this is a topic. This is a massive topic for business and organizations as a whole. And I think that was a massive value, and the amount of tension that it got, and it was a huge committee as well, wasn't it? So that's the first thing to say. So we have, we're very lucky within our expert group is that we often have people who are expert in another committee, in our group. So that's true for governance, for example, for a number of aspects of oversight, and it's also true for social responsibility. So obviously, Carnahan, you were involved at the beginning, but all the way through, Adriana from Argentina has been involved, and she was involved in the development of 26000. So she would just keep making sure that, and highlighting if there were inconsistencies. And sometimes we would override that and say, well, we disagree with what's in there, so we're going to, put this, but wherever we possibly could, we would align. So I would say there's, good alignment between the two. And really, ultimately, this is a fundamental standard that says this is how you can govern an organization so that it is not possible, if you follow this standard, it is not possible to be working against the value of the well-being value for society. If you really did do everything in this, and we call this the sort of the mafia test. So, and we agreed up front, because there was a question at the beginning, should this be relevant to literally all organizations, even if they were the mafia, because it's a big remit. And we had to absolutely definitively say, no, this is not for the mafia, or it is, but when they've finished, they won't be the mafia anymore. So that was an explicit agreement. So I would say not only is there a principle on social responsibility, but ultimately this is about an organization being aligned with society's best interests, and therefore in the best interests of the organization, because ultimately those are, and not even ultimately, even in the very short and medium term, as we're realizing, are intimately connected. So that I would say on 26000. I don't know, maybe Carnahan, if you had anything else to add on that with your expertise of the 26000.
Well, just to say that you do, the ISO 37000 draws directly on some very key definitions from the ISO 26000 standard, including the definition of social responsibility and ethical behavior and international norms of behavior and so on. So there is a really strong effort to connect them. And what I would say is that ISO 26000 is a normative standard. It's not neutral. It's saying this is how you achieve good being recognizing and addressing your impacts, environmental, social, and economic. And so is 37000. And as a result of that, to your mafia test, it would be impossible for an organization that does not have a social, environmental, economic, positive purpose to achieve. It could not possibly use this standard. That's kind of the entry point for using this standard is you must be trying to achieve these positive aims. And so therefore, clearly the mafia would not qualify. Yeah. So I like that mafia test as a way of describing that.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was, a set of interesting discussions. I think that international norms of behavior is a really important one as well. So we really did lean on and benefit from those discussions that had happened previously, and particularly what comes to mind is international norms of behavior, because ultimately, for example, we had to be clear that an organization to be acting ethically would need to go sometimes beyond the law. Because the idea that an organization just does what the law demands, we know can cause all kinds of issues, especially if it's like, oh, well, there are lesser laws over here, so we'll just, work with it. Actually, this is about the right kind of behavior. And we're not starting from nowhere on that. So And the same is true when we talk about universal values of what is good. We do have, and these are encoded in international norms around what we think is a good way to be and a good way to act, and what value is, and the essence of essentially what underpins well-being, which is, you know, the ultimate state that human and non-human life, you know, ultimate positive state that we're trying to achieve. So that was very, very helpful. And there's a really good definition of international norms there, so that it doesn't just become subjectively, you know, going around in a dead loop, because it is anchored to something that is ultimately has value and values. So the second one on SMEs and not-for-profit, and I have to declare here, I really, really don't like the term not-for-profit or for-profit, because really what we mean is for-profit maximization, which is a form of running a business which has, you know, peaked in prominence, and we're fast understanding, and in my personal view, is at the heart of really the issues that we face. Because if your ultimate value that you're trying to generate is income for yourself based on your self-interest, and you're legislated for that, or at least you know, regulated for that, then, you know, why would you not asset strip society? Of course you would. So that's my personal view. So when we use the term not-for-profit, we don't mean not-for-profit. Every organization needs profit, if we define profit as a financial excess over expenditure. Otherwise, how do you invest in your purpose? How do you make stuff happen? How do you satisfy your stakeholders? You know, I don't know about you, but I've invested in a whole range of not-for-profit organizations, through bonds, through whatever. So I think it's an idea whose time has come to go. So that's the first thing to say. And I think every time we use that term, we feed into the old system, which I think needs to go. And in terms of SME, so yeah, it should be totally as applicable for every organization. We really try to circle round to say, does this work? Does this work? Now, we do understand that for SMEs and smaller organizations, that more interpretation is probably needed to help understand, well, okay, yes, I can see the principle is correct, but that behavior, you know, how do I actually do that? And probably what will happen is, we will, as people start to work with it and we start to understand where that guidance is needed, we can start to produce that. But yeah, absolutely, this was produced for all organizations. And we had recognized right at the beginning, and in fact, oh no, I don't have it on this slide set, but there is, if we looked at the existing standards around governance or codes or you know, guidance globally, before ISO 37000, what you had was some organizations that had multiple codes that were relevant to it, including sort of charity sector. But if you operated in different domains, you might have 2 or 3, depending on the region in which you operated or whatever. And then you had some organizations that literally had nothing, no guidance at all. And therefore, the implication is, well, governance is not important for me. But of course, governance is important for all organizations. So it plugs in one fell swoop that gap, and therefore enables us to have a common language conversation to become governance literate. Because not only do we need good governance of organizations, but we in society are the ultimate governing body. So if we are not good at governance, and we don't understand the kind of governance we want to bring back about in the organizations that we allow to exist in democratic countries, then, you know, we have a serious problem. So yeah, that's the note on SMEs. On ethics and ethical behavior, yes, you can see around the outside edge, and I didn't mention that, is ethical behavior is a governance outcome. So, you know, sort of like, it's just expressing, if you do all of this, these are the kinds of outcomes that you would expect. And so ultimately, sustainable development, you might say, you could put around, you know, in the achievement of long-term well-being for all. If all organizations operated like that, you know, that would be the ultimate outcome. So ethical behavior is an outcome, but it's also explicitly dealt with, well, to be honest, throughout. I think you find it in nearly all the principles, explicitly or implicitly, and certainly within the leadership principle. The idea of ethical and effective behavior is very explicitly written. And we sort of drew from, and I think it was Barrett who, in terms of the definition of ethics, you know, and this is really super helpful for me, is that you are acting ethically if you are aligned with the moral landscape in which you operate. And of course, in this context, talking about those international norms of behavior is the ultimate moral context in which we're operating. So you need to understand that context in order to be able to say that you're acting ethically. And then we have the last one on certification. Yeah. So yes, the guidance standard. And that was really helpful. Well, it was also, to be honest, completely necessary, because if it was a certifiable standard, then it would need to conform to what's called the high level structure. So in order to make sure that ISO standards are not just one big spaghetti soup of difficultness, and that organizations can adopt a new standard and plug it into their existing systems, there is something called the high level structure, and it sets out things you have to do, language you have to use, structure you have to use, so that it is plug and play, basically. So had we created it as a management system standard, already we would have fallen at the first hurdle, because unfortunately, there is a definition in the high level structure called top management, which essentially describes governance, but mushes governing bodies and executive leaders, senior leaders in one thing. So that is an issue which we dealt with by clarifying our definitions, and I hope that the high level structure will change to reflect that, but certainly it does bring that clarification. Now, just because that means that it therefore is not certifiable within the sort of CASCO, which is the name for ISO oversees those who audit and certify to make sure that it's done well, even though it doesn't fit within that sort of certification. Anyone, and this is the case often, anyone can come along and say, oh, there's a guidance standard. Let me help you. I will help you to implement this standard. Now, of course, there's no quality control over that, and that's the risk. But nonetheless, it does mean that as of this very moment, I am sure across the world, there are many people busily creating their offer to help organizations to implement ISO 37000. So, and what I would say, therefore, is the key thing is that we have the standard, whilst there's a risk to that, ultimately we have the standard and the words are in black and white. So we can just keep going back and saying, well, is this really what is meant? So I'm hoping people can't go too off the mark in terms of giving bad advice in terms of the standard.
Well, and you have to start somewhere, and starting with the principles and the overarching conceptual framework is clearly where you need to start. It's the foundation. So perhaps that will be down the way. A couple of questions have come in. One is with ISO 37000, how do you think this links to and lives together with management system standards like ISO 9001, ISO 14001, ISO 45001, and so on? So that's one question. Another is, you stressed involvement of less developed countries. Does the standard explicitly address equity and inclusion of indigenous and racialized people within the organization's country?
Okay, shall I? All right, so I'll start with the last one first. So the way it's a real art pulling together a standard like this, because a lot of what's said is said by implication, as in it's clear what the implication is, but you don't go so far as to specify all of the instances that would result in. And there aren't examples. And it's really interesting because at the beginning, we want this to be super practical. Let's try and get lots of examples. And I think everyone starts off thinking that. And then you start to put examples in and you think, oh my gosh, this has got to be for all countries, in all sectors, and all types of organizations. We've just created an example that excludes 95% of those. So ultimately, what you're doing is narrowing the cognitive scope rather than leaving it at the level you need to, so that everyone can interpret it in a way that's useful for them. So when it comes to, for example, mentioning indigenous populations, for example, like you said, it's not that it's not in there, it's not explicitly said, but it is implicitly framed, if you see what I mean. So there are at least 2 or 3 occasions of talking about, for example, asymmetry of information, governing body recognizing that where particular groups or excluded groups, or I can't remember the language we use, but it basically says, if you have organizations or people who are affected by what you do, but have less ability to moan, you have to make extra special effort, make sure that you understand their perspective. So that's just an example, but there are other examples throughout there. So those sorts of things were very much on our mind, but we wouldn't say it as explicitly as perhaps some people might have liked. And if you ever come across that, usually if you just think through, how would that sound if you're a different kind of organization? Usually you'll think, okay, there's a reason that that is not explicitly mentioned because it's too specific to a particular context or a particular type of organization or something like that. That doesn't mean we've got it right all the time, but that tends to be the approach.
Right. Well, I think what it is a very clear message throughout the standard is that whoever you are having an impact on as an organization, you need to consider their interests. You need to find a way of ensuring that you are accurately understanding whatever are their interests, and you are taking those into account in what it is you're doing. And diversity is specifically talked about in there as well. So I think it probably comes in most clearly under the stakeholder side of things and the process associated with ensuring that the stakeholder views are fully taken into account, those within the organization and those outside that have an impact or could have an impact on the organization, or that the organization has an impact on them. So I would agree with you that it's contemplated without explicitly, naming Indigenous or anything like that. The other question was the linkage to things like 37,001 and so on. Can you just say a little bit about how that works?
Yeah, I think I'll probably just go back to the previous point I made about the it not being a management system standard, which means it isn't plug and play in the same way that it would be if it was. But in its development, in the wide consultation we had with internal liaisons, et cetera, it is very much made, we hope that there aren't major inconsistencies, and we work really hard for that to be the case. For example, there was someone from the Chartered Quality Institute who was on the course, who was on the part of the expert group, keeping us true to that part. So we kind of rely, and this is and I just wanted to also say this, I've expressed here some of my personal views, and it's important, I think, that people, and there would be times where I would take off my convener hat and I'd put my expert hat and I'd say, look, genuinely, this is why I think this is really important. But actually, my job was there. In fact, it was kind of hard in a way, because I gave up my voice in many ways in order to be able to bring this consensus view to the table. And facilitate the process of essentially making sure that when it comes to those other standards, that we are not making life harder for people. So we really kept in mind the objective, which is, this is not just about helping the world have a clear, united voice, to be able to become governance literate, to be able to drive and hold to account the organizations we need, but also to help and support everything else that therefore, as a result, or previously, that the organization's trying to do. If we'd have produced this and made everything else really hard, then that wouldn't have been much use. So I hope that we've done that. But in using this standard, if you come across things that you think genuinely, need to change and not done right, I mean, that's what we want. We want a world engaged with this now, and engaged with governance in a way that perhaps hadn't happened before. And then when it comes to revision, we can make it even better.
Well, my congratulations to you and to everyone in the working group for not just hacking a path through, because that suggests it would be something that's very rough-hewn, but this is really an extremely well thought out, integrated, comprehensive approach to bring this all together and to be useful to all sorts of organizations around the world. I think it's an amazing achievement. It's clearly just the start, in the sense of there's many more standards and related work that's going to be coming from ISO TC 309. Victoria, I want to thank you for all your work in getting it to this stage and in presenting it to us and having this discussion today. Hopefully we can have you back perhaps when the indicators work comes out, or otherwise, as the case might be.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and or the purpose-driven organization PAS, which of course is open for comment until tomorrow and can have comments from all over the world. So your thoughts on that also, if you want to distribute. I think I sent you the link, Kernahan,
Yes.
please.
Speaking of which, is this deck or some variation on it, is that something that we will put up this video up on the Ryerson CSR Institute website, but is there a version of this deck that you can supply us, and we'll put that up there as well as an accompanying document?
I'm happy to give you this. This is the most recent one, and this this is a generic, was built from a generic deck that we as a communications group, the communications group pulled together. So this is the only one exists at the moment, and you can see it was a 30-minute presentation I did for ISO Southern African group, but I'm happy to send that, and you can put it there just with a note to say this is was for a different group. Yeah,
I will do that. Thanks again. Have a terrific holiday break. Thank you, everybody, for your questions and participation. Great questions. More events where we're going to dig down directly into organizations in January. Insider view of how you transform an organization into a sustainability-oriented organization, and so on. So stay tuned for those. Just go up on the Ryerson CSR Institute website page for more information on that. Have a terrific holidays, everybody. And thanks again, Victoria. Fantastic work. See you all soon.
thank you. Thanks.
Bye now.
Bye.